A generation watched tens of millions of people die from something they couldn't see, couldn't touch, and couldn't stop. And their response was to throw the wildest, loudest, most unapologetically hedonistic decade in modern history. Today, we're tracing the full psychological arc of the early 20th century, from the 1918 influenza pandemic through the Roaring Twenties and straight into Prohibition. And by the end of this episode, you'll understand how fear, pleasure, and moral backlash didn't just shape a decade, they built the psychological conditions for catastrophe. I've got someone here who has gone deep into this story, and I want to start right at the beginning. What actually broke the world open before the Jazz Age even started?
So the thing that most people miss is that the Roaring Twenties didn't come from prosperity, they came from trauma. And to understand that, you have to go back to what was happening in the scientific and cultural imagination of the early 1900s.
Right, because this isn't just about the pandemic itself.
Exactly. So germ theory, the idea that invisible microbial agents cause disease, had been established in laboratories by people like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the 19th century, but it was still largely confined to scientists and physicians. What changed in the early 20th century was that it seeped into public consciousness. There's a figure named Irwin Frink Smith, a plant pathologist, who between 1905 and 1914 demonstrated that bacteria caused plant diseases. And that sounds niche, but the cultural implication was enormous.
Because if bacteria can devastate crops, they can devastate people.
Precisely. Smith's work helped create a cultural moment where the world felt permeated by unseen threats. The idea of contamination became a constant background hum of anxiety. And then the 1918 influenza pandemic hit, and it confirmed every fear. It killed tens of millions worldwide. Hospitals collapsed. Governments issued contradictory guidance. Families watched loved ones fall ill in the morning and die by nightfall.
That speed is just, that's terrifying on a level that's hard to even process.
And the psychological damage went way beyond the physical death toll. People learned that the state was impotent. Science could name the enemy but couldn't stop it. The world was not orderly, not predictable, not safe. And by the end of 1919, you have a population that is exhausted. The Great War had shattered political structures. The pandemic had shattered emotional ones. Returning soldiers had seen too much death. Young people felt cheated of life itself.
So the setup for the 20s is basically a civilization in collective grief?
That's exactly it. And Alfred Adler, the psychologist, predicted this kind of response. He argued that people respond to feelings of inferiority and existential crisis through compensation. They seek belonging, significance, and stability. And what the 1920s offered was all three, just in the most spectacular, loud, and intoxicating way possible.
So the Roaring Twenties are essentially a civilization's coping mechanism.
A desperate one. The decade's hedonism, the jazz, the speed, the sexual liberation, the intoxicants. It wasn't frivolity. It was therapy. It was a collective refusal to remain afraid. People wanted to forget the smell of hospitals and the silence of quarantines. They wanted to drown memory in music.
And jazz specifically becomes this kind of sonic symbol of that refusal.
Jazz did not simply entertain, it defied. Its syncopation broke the rigid patterns of Victorian respectability. Its improvisation rejected the predictability of the past. In crowded clubs and smoky speakeasies, people found a new kind of freedom. The music was loud, chaotic, and alive, everything the pandemic had not been. And then you have figures like Josephine Baker, born in 1906 in St. Louis, whose performances were electric and unapologetically modern. She was a living symbol of liberation from fear.
Though not everyone saw her that way.
Right, and that tension is crucial. To her fans, jazz was therapy. To her critics, it was the devil playing on his fife, seducing God's weary children into a life of degenerate sin. That word, degenerate, is going to become very important later in this story.
Okay, and alongside jazz, you've got the flapper, which I think people today kind of reduced to a fashion trend, but it was way more than that.
So much more. The flapper rejected the Victorian ideal of female fragility. She cut her hair short, shortened her skirts, smoked cigarettes, danced in public, and refused to be quiet. She was a cultural revolution. Zelda Sayre Fitzgerald, born in 1900 in Montgomery, Alabama, became one of the era's most iconic figures. Her life, filled with dance, art, and defiance, captured the spirit of a generation determined to live loudly. And her husband, F. Scott Fitzgerald, born in 1896 in St. Paul, Minnesota, chronicled the decade's glittering surface and its hollow core in The Great Gatsby.
Joy built on trauma, pleasure built on denial. That's such a precise way to put it.
And then there's Art Deco, which I think is the most underrated part of this whole story. If jazz gave the decade its rhythm, Art Deco gave it its face. It emerged from a world desperate to feel beautiful again after years of war and pandemic. It announced itself at the 1925 Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes in Paris. Chrome, lacquer, exotic woods, sharply defined geometry. Sunbursts, chevrons, zigzags. It embraced the machine age not as a threat, but as a promise.
And it wasn't just in galleries, it was everywhere.
Everywhere. Radios, toasters, clocks, cocktail shakers, cigarette cases, all transformed into miniature sculptures. The Chrysler Building in New York, completed in 1930, with its stainless steel crown and radiating sunburst arches, that's the movement's masterpiece. Cities became galleries. Streets became runways. Art Deco was optimism made visible. It assumed prosperity, stability, and endless innovation.
Which makes what happened to it even more devastating.
World War II didn't merely interrupt Art Deco, it extinguished it. Materials became scarce, austerity became patriotic, and fascist regimes labeled modern art degenerate. The future that Art Deco had imagined, shimmering skyscrapers, sculptural automobiles, glamorous public spaces, was replaced by ration books and rubble. And here's the thing that haunts me about this. Art Deco was what the world was becoming. It was the alternate future that never arrived.
Okay, so we've got this decade of spectacular release, jazz, flappers, Art Deco, automobiles, cinema. But underneath all of it, there's also the intoxicants. And that's where the story starts to get darker.
Alcohol and narcotics were the lowest common denominators of pleasure. Democratic intoxicants that allowed anyone, regardless of class, to participate in the decade's euphoric abandon. Speakeasies multiplied, bootleg liquor flowed, cocaine and opiates circulated quietly through jazz clubs and urban nightlife. People were not simply drinking, they were forgetting. The decade's hedonism was anesthesia.
And that's exactly what alarmed the other half of America.
Exactly. Because pleasure provokes its opposite. As jazz clubs filled and skirts shortened and modernity accelerated, a counter-movement gathered strength in the shadows. It was rural, Protestant, moralistic, and deeply anxious. It saw the decade not as therapy but as degeneracy. It believed the nation had lost its way, abandoned its virtues, and surrendered to temptation.
And that counter-movement had a very effective strategist.
Wayne Wheeler, born in 1869 in Brookfield Township, Ohio. As the chief architect of the Anti-Saloon League, Wheeler mastered political pressure, lobbying, and moral rhetoric. He transformed temperance from a moral plea into a legislative force. And in 1920, Prohibition arrived with the passage of the Volstead Act, named for Andrew Volstead, born in 1860 in Kenyon, Minnesota, to Norwegian immigrants. The act defined intoxicating liquors, established enforcement mechanisms, and attempted to regulate desire itself.
A nation trying to outlaw pleasure.
And it fundamentally misunderstood why people were drinking. People were not drinking because they were wicked. They were drinking because they were wounded. Prohibition attempted to cure trauma with punishment. And the fracture it exposed was not just geographic, rural versus urban, it was psychological. Rural America feared contamination, cultural, sexual, and moral. Urban America embraced diversity, experimentation, and modernity.
So what actually happened when the law took effect?
The Volstead Act did not eliminate intoxicants. It eliminated regulation. Demand remained, supply went underground. Within weeks, bootleggers were smuggling liquor across borders, distilling moonshine in rural barns, and bribing police to look the other way. Speakeasies multiplied in basements, back rooms, and behind false walls. Passwords replaced menus. Whisper networks replaced advertisements. The nightlife of the Roaring Twenties did not die. It simply moved underground, where it became more secretive, more exclusive, and more profitable.
And more dangerous.
Far more dangerous. The state had attempted to regulate morality. Instead, it deregulated crime. And organized crime filled the void with astonishing speed. What had once been scattered criminal activity became a coordinated industrial enterprise. Smuggling routes stretched from Canada to the Caribbean. Distribution networks operated with the efficiency of legitimate corporations. Bootleggers used fleets of trucks, ships, and even airplanes to move product. Vice became a business, and business was booming.
And the person who most perfectly embodied that transformation was Meyer Lansky.
Meyer Lansky, born Meyer Sukovlansky in 1902 in Grodno, Belarus, to Max and Yetta Sukovlansky, immigrated to New York as a child and grew up in the Lower East Side. Small, quiet, and mathematically gifted, he possessed none of the theatrical bravado associated with gangsters. He was not a brawler, he was not a showman, he was a strategist. Nobody could pronounce his name, so he became known as Lansky.
What made him different from the other crime figures of the era?
Where others saw crime, Lansky saw markets. Where others saw danger, Lansky saw acceptable risk. Where others saw vice, Lansky saw demand. He built syndicates the way industrialists built factories, with precision, discipline, and an obsession with optimization. He partnered with Charles Lucky Luciano, born in 1897 in Sicily, who provided organizational muscle and political connections. Together, they created a national crime network that operated like a corporation, centralized planning, decentralized execution, and strict enforcement of contracts.
Journalists of the period called what they ran Murder Inc., right?
They did. But despite that reputation, Lansky's empire was not actually built on brutality, it was built on mathematics. He understood liquidity, risk, and diversification. He understood that prohibition was not a moral crisis, but a market distortion. The state had created a monopoly, and he intended to control it. Their mentor, Arnold Rothstein, born in 1882 in New York City, had pioneered the idea that crime could be run like a business. Rothstein taught Lansky that violence was inefficient, unpredictability was costly, and reputation was currency.
And when Rothstein was murdered in 1928, Lansky inherited not just his networks, but his entire philosophy.
Exactly. And the syndicate model they built transformed organized crime from a local nuisance into a national institution. It created stability, predictability, and profit. It allowed criminal enterprises to expand into gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, and international smuggling. Prohibition had attempted to impose moral order. The syndicate imposed economic order instead.
But I want to push back a little here because there's a tendency to almost romanticize Lansky as this brilliant entrepreneur. The speakeasies and the syndicate caused real harm.
That's a really important point, and the search results are very clear on this. Speakeasies normalized lawbreaking as a routine social activity. Millions of ordinary citizens, professionals, artists, laborers, even politicians entered illegal establishments nightly, eroding respect for the rule of law. This casual criminality created a culture in which bribery became expected, police corruption became systemic, and the legitimacy of public institutions deteriorated.
And the harm went even deeper than that.
Much deeper. Drinks were frequently adulterated with dangerous chemicals, leading to poisoning, blindness, and death. Women entering speakeasies often faced predatory environments where the absence of regulation meant the absence of protection. And beneath the glamour of speakeasy nightlife was a brutal system of human trafficking. Lansky's syndicate, like other organized crime networks, profited from trafficking women, often recent arrivals from Eastern Europe or Latin America, who were lured with false promises of employment and then forced into prostitution.
So the glamour concealed something genuinely monstrous.
The absence of regulation meant the absence of protection. Trafficked women had no legal recourse, no labor rights, and no safe exit. Their exploitation was not incidental but structural, woven into the business model of criminal enterprises that treated human beings as commodities alongside alcohol and narcotics. Prohibition had promised purity. Speakeasies delivered a seductive but corrosive form of freedom that left American society more fractured, more violent, and more cynical than before.
And by the mid-1920s, it was clear the whole experiment had failed.
Citizens saw the hypocrisy of politicians who drank privately while condemning drink publicly. They saw the corruption of police who accepted bribes. They saw the rise of criminal empires that operated more efficiently than the government. The moralists had attempted to purify society. Instead, they had empowered the very forces they feared. The shadow market became a mirror, reflecting the contradictions of a nation torn between pleasure and purity, modernity and tradition, freedom and control.
Okay, so now I want to bring in the thread that I think most people don't connect to this story at all, and that's what's happening in Europe during all of this, because there's a figure watching all of this very carefully.
Adolf Hitler. And to understand how he interpreted the 1920s, you have to understand his single obsessive lens, degeneracy. To him, those who spread disease were degenerate. Those who engaged in immoral sex were degenerate. Those who enjoyed jazz were degenerate. Those who painted progressive art were degenerate. Those who embraced modern freedoms were degenerate. This was not analysis, it was prejudice. Not diagnosis, but ideology.
And he had been studying how to weaponize that ideology.
He spent the decade studying the new masters of mass influence. Charlie Chaplin's physical rhetoric, how Chaplin commanded millions without speaking. Franklin Roosevelt's intimate radio style and its emotional reach. Joseph Stalin's ruthless consolidation of power and his capacity to starve nations into submission. Hitler was watching, studying, and waiting. And he had a narrative ready, the stab in the back.
Which is where Leon Trotsky enters the story in a way that I think genuinely surprises people.
So, in the summer of 1918, Trotsky was serving as People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs, effectively the founder and commander of the Red Army. He was the second most powerful man in Soviet Russia after Lenin. He controlled military strategy, logistics, recruitment, and political oversight of the army. And in July 1918, the Bolshevik position around Yekaterinburg was deteriorating with alarming speed.
Because the White Army was closing in on the Romanovs.
The Romanovs, held in the Ipatiev house, were not merely former monarchs, they were potential rallying points for anti-Bolshevik forces. White units were reportedly within a day's march, and the Czech Legion had already taken nearby towns. By the evening of July 16, Bolshevik commanders in Yekaterinburg concluded the city might fall at any moment. The Romanovs were moved to the basement, and the executions were carried out in the most brutal fashion imaginable. And what followed was even worse.
And the Romanov women were ethnically German through their mother.
Which is exactly what Hitler's propaganda machine seized on. Whether Trotsky explicitly ordered the executions or merely accepted them as wartime necessity remains debated. He was not physically present, but he was unquestionably the commander to whom the executioners would have had to turn for approval of such an order. And to the German public, to every German mother and daughter and sister, Trotsky was personally responsible.
And then Trotsky does something that seems almost impossible to believe. He simultaneously negotiates peace with Germany and tries to ignite a revolution inside it.
This is the part that rewrites how you understand the stab-in-the-back narrative. At Brest-Litovsk, while Trotsky was negotiating Russia's exit from the war, a wholesale capitulation that included the loss of huge swaths of Russian territory to the Kaiser, he was simultaneously ordering socialist revolutionaries among Germany's dock workers to stage a revolution. His famous formula, neither war nor peace, was not merely a negotiating tactic. It was a message to German workers that the Bolsheviks were waiting for Germany's own revolution to erupt.
And it worked.
The final year of World War I saw Germany's northern ports, Hamburg, Bremen, Kiel, Lübeck, erupt into strikes and riots that shook the Kaiser's war machine. Dock workers, sailors, and shipyard laborers were pushed to the breaking point. The Kiel Mutiny in October 1918, where sailors seized ships, fought officers, and established workers' councils, was the most dramatic example. In early 1919, radicals in Bremen attempted to establish a Soviet-style republic explicitly modeled on Trotsky's revolution.
So Hitler's stab-in-the-back accusation wasn't entirely invented.
This is where it gets genuinely complicated. The German people were, in a very real sense, stabbed in the back by Trotsky twice, and in the most psychologically devastating fashion imaginable. The Romanov executions incited every German woman loyal to the cause, and Trotsky's revolutionary broadcasts at Brest-Litovsk helped collapse the German war effort from within. Hitler required no proof. He fused those two events with prejudice and created a narrative in which purity was the only path to survival.
And that narrative became potent at a very specific moment.
The stock market crash of 1929. When markets collapsed, the illusions of the Jazz Age collapsed with them. The social psyche, already strained by decades of trauma, war, pandemic, prohibition's failures, the rise of criminal empires, became newly vulnerable. Fear returned, humiliation returned, and into that vulnerability stepped a man who had been watching, studying, and waiting.
There's also this strange footnote in the story. Lansky actually confronted the Nazi presence in America directly.
The German-American Bund held rallies in New York City that openly celebrated Hitler and promoted anti-Semitic ideology. For Jewish communities, many of whom were recent immigrants with direct memories of European anti-Semitism, the Bund's activities were not abstract political theater. They were a frightening echo of the violence unfolding overseas. And Lansky, who had fled anti-Semitic persecution in Eastern Europe as a child, organized violent disruptions of Bund meetings. He and a small group of associates infiltrated gatherings, overturning tables, breaking furniture, and physically assaulting uniformed members.
He later claimed he told his men not to use weapons, that the goal was humiliation rather than murder.
But the confrontations were undeniably violent. And here's the irony. Lansky's actions played right into the hands of the National Socialists, who were at that time casting themselves as historically wronged peoples. His vigilantism, however understandable given his background, gave the Bund exactly the victim narrative they wanted. It's a rare example of pre-war America where the Nazis were not the perpetrators, but the targets, and it illustrates the volatile intersection of immigrant trauma, rising fascism, and the failure of civic institutions to protect vulnerable communities.
And yet, to Hitler himself, Lansky barely registered.
There's nothing to suggest Lansky ever rose to anything approaching a priority in Hitler's mind. To the National Socialists, the German-American Bund was essentially cosplay, a quaint emulation of the National Socialist Party, at best a propaganda opportunity. Lansky could have dismantled them entirely and still not registered in Hitler's mind. It was Trotsky who was living rent-free in Hitler's head. Always Trotsky.
So when you step back from all of this, the pandemic, the jazz age, prohibition, the syndicates, the stab in the back, what's the through line that connects it all?
It's a single psychological arc. A society wounded by invisible enemies, the 1918 pandemic, germ theory's anxiety, the Great War, swings violently toward pleasure as a form of survival. That pleasure alarms the moralists, who attempt to suppress it through prohibition. Prohibition fails spectacularly, industrializing the very vices it sought to eliminate and empowering criminal syndicates that corrupt every institution they touch. And the chaos, the hypocrisy, the fracture between rural and urban America, all of it creates a social psyche that is exhausted, cynical, and desperate for order.
And the crash of 1929 is the moment all of those threads converge.
The crash didn't just destroy wealth, it destroyed the psychological defenses that the jazz age had built. The dancing stopped, the music went quiet, and the fear that the Roaring Twenties had been running from came rushing back. In Germany, that fear had a name and a face, and a very specific set of scapegoats already prepared. The conditions created by microbial fear, hedonistic release, Puritan backlash, and criminal enterprise didn't just shape a decade, they created the psychological opening for the darkest chapter of the 20th century.
And what's striking is that Lansky and Hitler, as different as they were both responses to the same wound.
That's the most unsettling part of this whole story. One built order through markets, accommodating human desire, treating vice as a commodity, creating stability through economic logic. The other built order through myth, demanding obedience, offering belonging through exclusion, promising dignity through purifying violence. Lansky compensated through accommodation. Hitler compensated through domination. But both men were shaped by the same fractured world, and both were exploiting the same desperate human need for stability and meaning.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. The early 20th century is not just a history lesson. It's a case study in what happens when collective trauma goes unprocessed.
That's exactly right. The 1918 pandemic created a wound. The Roaring Twenties were the bandage, spectacular, loud, and ultimately insufficient. Prohibition was the attempt to pretend the wound didn't exist by outlawing the bandage. And organized crime was the infection that set in when the wound was left untreated. Every step of the way, the underlying trauma was never actually addressed. It was suppressed, monetized, moralized, and finally weaponized.
And the actionable insight here isn't just historical. It's about recognizing the pattern.
When you see a society swinging between extremes, between wild liberation and moral crackdown, between hedonism and puritanism, that's not a sign of cultural health. That's a sign of unprocessed collective trauma looking for an outlet. The Roaring Twenties were not a celebration of strength. They were a flight from weakness. And the tragedy is that the flight itself created the conditions for something far worse than the original fear.
And Art Deco is almost the saddest symbol of that. This entire aesthetic future, chrome, glamour, optimism made visible, just extinguished.
Art Deco was what the world was becoming. It assumed prosperity, stability, and endless innovation. It imagined a future in which technology and beauty could coexist. And the National Socialists and the Socialist International both opposed it for exactly that reason, because it was the aesthetic of a world they wanted to destroy. The trauma of the early century might have healed through beauty rather than violence. Instead, it collapsed into fascism, genocide, and total war.
So we started this episode with a generation that watched tens of millions die from something invisible and responded by throwing the wildest decade in modern history. And what we've traced is how that response, however understandable, however human, set off a chain of consequences that nobody could have predicted and nobody could stop.
The invisible enemy of 1918 didn't just kill tens of millions of people. It launched a psychological chain reaction that reshaped the entire century.
Fear created the desire for release. Release created the desire for liberation. Liberation provoked backlash. Backlash created criminal enterprise. Criminal enterprise corrupted institutions. And corrupted institutions left a fractured, cynical, desperate world open to the worst kind of political opportunism.
Sein Sowjetzeichen soll vor sich hertragen und wir werden in unserem Zeichen wieder siegen!